When we hear the word generosity, we tend to think about our generosity. How much do we give? Where do we give? How do we give? But I think we should first start with God's generosity. He's the first giver. He goes first. When we look at history and we see William Wilberforce, who was the great abolitionist against slavery in the 18th century, Wilberforce often called God his great benefactor and patron. He knew the generosity of God, and it fueled a generous life in response. And so, as we think about God's generosity, we have to begin at creation. He didn't have to make us. He didn't have to create this world, but he did. He chose to. And he made a beautiful home for us. For Adam and Eve, he put them in this garden and gave them the fruit trees, all the beautiful trees to enjoy and to eat from. There's just one tree that he said, that's not for you. That's to remind you that you're guests here, that this is not your home. And that's a gracious and even a generous reminder. God gave them each other. He gave them this beautiful work to do with one another, outside, naming the animals, cultivating the garden. Adam and Eve rejected that. They rejected the God who is generous toward them and ran away, much like the prodigal son rejects the generosity of his father and goes to a faraway country thinking he'll be happier. And the next way we see that God is generous towards us is that we needed a Savior. We needed redemption. And like the father in the prodigal son story, he ran to us. God ran to us at the cross. God came into this messy world that we live in, into this sin-sick, twisted world. Jesus entered as our God and Savior and gave his own life for us. He laid down his life for us. He gave up himself. God didn't just write a check from heaven. He didn't just send a messenger or an envoy. He came among us. And he didn't just come among us as an example or to give advice. He came among us as a Savior who would live a perfect life for us and die the death that we deserve. He traded places with us. When we had death because of sin and he had life, he switched it so that we can have life through his death. This is the generosity of our God, that we have been loved. We have been lavishly loved and shown incredible grace by a generous God who is abounding in rich grace for us. We need to soak this in and take this into our hearts, that all that we have and all that we are is a gift from him. We're not our own. We've been bought with a price, and we belong to Jesus. When that grips our hearts, when we see his generosity towards us, the natural response is to overflow in the same way, to become like the Father, to show his generosity through our generosity, his life through our lives. The generosity of God is where it starts. When we see that Jesus, though he was rich in heaven, became poor, and born into this poor world in a poor little family. But by his life and by his death, we who were spiritually poor now become rich. We see our God is a father, a generous father, and a generous Savior. We want this to grip our hearts, grip our lives, and then fuel us to live lives in response of generosity.